All right. Well, it is 11 a.m. Thank you to everyone who's watching. Hi, everybody. Happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining us for what is sure to be an engaging and fascinating 45 minutes. In this session, What is Your Watershed Address? You will hear from Aleisha Miller, St. Croix County's environmental educator. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those questions into the session Q&A section on the right side of your screen. Other comments can be shared in the session chat area. With that, I will now hand it over to Aleisha.
Hello, welcome today. I'm excited to see on the side of my screen. How about that? And I am working for St Croix County, so that is in and Hudson into Wisconsin. So try and give you guys some where I am actually in Baldwin today, but still in St. Croix County. And today we're going to discuss about watershed addresses. So I'm going to change my screen, or share my screen, I should say. Nope, that's not the one I wanted. I want this one. And so now I understand that you can see this. Is that correct? Because I can't see anything but my screen. So is that correct?
That is correct. We can see your presentation.
Wonderful. All right. So watershed address, where you are in the world and a sense of place. So we all live on the earth, right? It's the water planet. And it's 75% water, 25% land. That's dry land, I should say. And everything that we do, it depends on water. So whether you are cleaning, whether you are growing food, whether you are manufacturing something, we need water. And even us, our bodies are 60% water. So not only do we depend on water, but it connects everything throughout the world and throughout our lives because of the water cycle. And as the water travels through the water cycle, it carries things with it. So it seems relevant that we address is and where we are in it. So to start with, well, what is a watershed? Well, a watershed is a region of land where any water that falls onto that land, either as rain or snow or hail or sleet, it falls onto the land and it will end up in a body of water. So it might end up in this picture in those little lakes up on top of the hill. It might end up in the river and then flow farther down and then into the harbor down there. We can also see in this picture the water cycle that's happening, because not only does water enter on land, but it also soaks into the ground. So we have groundwater interactions where water will flow through the ground. We might pump it up into our homes, into our cities. It might flow through the ground and recharge those bottoms of those lakes and those rivers. So the water cycle is a really important part of the watershed. Now the second question is, well, what is a watershed address? Well, just like a regular address, it's based on the watershed that you live in. And so we can compare our street address to our watershed address. And so this chart I have here, you're going to see multiple times because we're going to work through what our watershed address is, actually what the River Falls Public Library watershed address is. So if we compare to watershed address, right? So we have the country, the state, the county, the town and city, and the street for our street address. And for our watershed address, we have the ocean or gulf that the water eventually flows into. We have the major river, the large rivers, the tributary, and the local river that all flow along this path.
Aleisha, I'm just going to pause you for 1 second. I think we're not seeing the slides advancing at the same time.
Okay.
We're seeing that first slide.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. So you didn't see a watershed slide or a watershed address slide?
We're just seeing the intro slide at the moment.
Well, that is odd. Let's see here. Okay, well, we'll do it. What if I do it this way? We'll get out of the sharing view. I just did, okay.
Thank you everyone for your patience.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment here. I'm gonna go here. Let's skip out of that. Let's do it this way then. Let's try sharing my screen. And instead of it being the fancy PowerPoint, we will just allow it to watch like this. So you can see my screen now as it is.
Yes.
Click on this slide on the side now, you can see it changing.
Yes, we can. And
Awesome.
if you click present, we'll see it nice and big too.
Well, that's how I did it before, and we weren't seeing it. That's why I'm wondering. I'll try it one more time with the present, and we'll see if it changes. So can you see me changing the slides now?
I can't see the slides changing.
Yeah.
I can see your mouse cursor.
All right, now am I just in the regular PowerPoint without sharing it?
Yes.
Okay,
I'm seeing the regular PowerPoint.
We're just going to do it old school then. We'll do it this way. Old school for technology, right?
Sounds great. Thank you.
I'll just change it on the screen. So let me go back again. So when I was talking about the water planet, I actually had a picture of the water planet on there just to show you how much water there is on the Earth. And here is that image of a watershed. So over here we have the water and it falls down as precipitation, rain, sleet, snow, and it can either soak into the ground, it can flow into these ponds, or it can flow down the river and then eventually into this harbor out here. All right, so a watershed address. So this is what I said we'd be seeing multiple times throughout, and we're going to work our way through a watershed address. So in comparison to your street address, like you have a country, state, county, town, city, or street of your street address, in a watershed address, you would have the ocean or the gulf that the water runs into, and then your major rivers working their way backwards to your smallest rivers. All right. So here we are back at the water planet, and we want to know where the River Falls Public Library is. So we have to zoom in a little bit. And here we are in the Americas, right? So we're in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. And to give us a sense of reference, I put a star here of about where the Twin Cities are to give us all kind of a reference of where we are, and also the Gulf of Mexico, because eventually that's where our water ends up. So we zoom in a little bit closer because we need to know what continent we are on and what country we're in. So we're in North America. And in North America, we have, of course, the United States, we have Canada, and we have Mexico. And so in our watershed address, our country is the United States, right here. Now, what you see on this picture is a map of North America, but each of those colored sections, like this purple section here, this periwinkle section here, this orange section here, that is one watershed. And so these can be large areas of land, but they also can be smaller, because as you look at this picture, you might notice that this periwinkle section is divided into smaller sections. And each of these smaller sections is another watershed. So watersheds can be big or they can be small, and they can be inside of each other. So again, to give us a reference, there's our little star. So there we are in this orange part of this watershed. So our watershed address, our country would be the United States. And so for us, it's the Gulf of Mexico. Remember, that's where the water is going to end up, is at the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm going from bigger to smaller. It might be easier for you when you're figuring out your address to go from smaller to bigger. And at the end, we're going to do that. I'll go through it backwards again. So now here we have the Mississippi River watershed. And this is that orange section. We're right up in here. Click on that one. You can see we're right up in here. This whole entire colored section here, even though it's multiple colors, this is one watershed. That's the Mississippi River watershed. It's the biggest watershed in North America. As you can see, it drains over half of the lower 48 states. It also goes a little bit up into Canada. And so any water that falls as precipitation in this area eventually ends up into the Mississippi River. We as in people, have divided the Mississippi River up into smaller sections because it helps us manage it. And so we're going to end up with this next section, which is the upper Mississippi River section. First, our country was the United States, right? So our ocean and Gulf was the Gulf of Mexico. Our states are Minnesota and Wisconsin. So our major river is the Mississippi River. All right. So here you can see, this is that section I pointed out on the map. Minnesota, Wisconsin. This is the upper Mississippi River watershed. Again, to let you know where Minneapolis, St. Paul is. And then here's another view of it, but with those subdivisions divided out again. So we're taking this upper Mississippi River watershed and dividing it into smaller watersheds. So all this water in this section, this green section here, was going to flow into this blue river that's right there. And again, here we are in the Twin Cities for reference, and this is the watershed we're heading to next as we shrink down. So our country, United States, so Gulf of Mexico for us, Mississippi River watershed, and then we want to break it down into the upper Mississippi watershed. So here's the St. Croix River watershed. To give you a location, here's the Twin Cities. This is the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's right there. And so part of the watershed that we're talking about is in Minnesota, and part of the watershed we're talking about is in Wisconsin. And again, it's broken up into smaller watersheds for these smaller rivers. And so right down here is where we're heading next. And I put another star on here. This is where the River Falls Public Library is going to end up, because on the next picture, the Twin Cities is too far off to the west, and so we can't see it in the picture. So just to give you a little bit of a reference point here, and we're heading to this smaller watershed. So we've gotten a little bit smaller, right? Because now we're in the St. Croix River watershed. So the St. Croix River is what really inspired this conference. And part of the reason that it's so great is that part of the river is a wild and scenic river. And so this morning, when Natalie Warren was talking about going through areas of wild land, some of the St. Croix River is that way, where you can't see human impacts, except maybe a road going across, but you won't see development along the shoreline. And then we have the smaller Knicknack River watershed. And here is the River Falls Public Library. And so if someone were to ask me what my watershed address was, I would say it is the Knicknack River of the St. Croix River, of the Upper Mississippi River, of the Mississippi River, of the Gulf of Mexico. So you read them from the bottom to the top. And remember I said I could show you how you do it from a smaller to a bigger perspective. So if I didn't know where all my water flows, I can start with my small river. So here's my small river. I have the Knicknack River. And this water, this small watershed, is inside of a bigger watershed. It is inside of the St. Croix River watershed. So here's my Knicknack River watershed. Here's the St. Croix River watershed, right? It's much bigger. And the St. Croix River watershed is inside of the Upper Mississippi River watershed. So there's the St. Croix River watershed, the entire Upper Mississippi River watershed, which is inside of the Mississippi River watershed. And all of the water from the Mississippi River flows to the Gulf of Mexico. So that is how you determine your watershed address. And it's really important because we often don't think about water and how it connects us to everything. But if we're not careful, what happens in our watershed can wash downstream. And so if I pollute something in the Knicknack River watershed, it can pollute in the St Croix River watershed, in the upper Mississippi River watershed, in the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way down, the Mississippi watershed all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to stop sharing this because I am curious if people would like to try and figure out what their watershed address is. I have the information and I can show it on the screen again, and we can maybe put it in the chat. If you know what county you live in, we can start with what state you live in. If you want to try and figure out where your school is instead of where you actually are or where your city is.
Feel free to share in the chat any ideas or points you'd like to start in or where you're joining us from. Let's give this a try. I can kick us off with one. Oh, we have one from Michaela Moulter from River Falls.
Oh, River Falls.
And Aiden Miller is joining from Hudson, Wisconsin.
Perfect. So River Falls, lots of River Falls. Well, the great thing about River Falls is that that's where I'm from too, so I can give you some more insight into River Falls. So let me get back to, so in River Falls, the Knicknack River watershed is actually, you can break it up into a smaller watershed. And so down here we have the Rocky Branch, we have the South Fork, and then we have the main branch of the Knicknack, the Dry Run as well. And so we can actually have smaller watersheds. So if we're talking about the high school, River Falls High School area, that's going to be the Rocky Branch. If we're talking about, no, I take that back. No, that's right. If I'm talking about the university, you're going to be in the South Fork watershed, so in that area. And then if you're talking about north of River Falls, you're going to be in the main or the Dry Run. Now Hudson has a couple watersheds here. So because Hudson is right along the St. Croix River, some of your water might just go straight into the St. Croix. And so in that case, you would just be in the St. Croix River watershed. But you'll notice that this whole area here, this is the Willow River. And so anyone who lives in Hudson, you probably know that there's a road between Hudson and North Hudson, and that goes over Lake Malibu. Lake Malibu is an impoundment, and so that means that we put a dam on a river. So Lake Malibu is part of the Willow River, and so you're in the Willow River watershed. Let's see here. Did we have anyone from Minnesota? I don't know them as well, but I do have some Minnesota counties too.
We have a couple people joining us from Minnesota.
I saw that in the bigger group. I wasn't sure if we had any in our small group. Oh, Osceola, wonderful. All right. So Osceola, you're going to be up here. Let's see here. You know what? There's a better way for me to do this. Osceola, do you know what your county is? Because as you see, as I'm shrinking this down, I have a list here of every river in Wisconsin, in the St. Croix River watershed, and Minnesota in the St. Croix River watershed. So my friends from Osceola, I see in the chat someone said, is having a dam there a good thing or a bad thing? Well, dams can change the habitat because you are holding back water. Polk County, got it. And so having a dam there can affect the water quality because as the water comes down, it's faster and then it hits the dam when it slows down. And because the water is, when it's faster, it can carry lots of nutrients, it can carry lots of soil. And when it slows down, it drops those things. So what we find is that behind dams, they start to fill in because whatever came from upstream comes down the river and then will settle there. Because it flooded an area, it changed the habitat. And so from a wildlife point of view and a water quality point of view, having a dam is not necessarily a good thing. But looking at it from a water protection, so protecting from flooding, or from a hydropower point of view, a dam can be a good thing. So because we can make hydropower from it. And so this is that tricky area where you come into with conservation and environmental science, which is weighing the pros and the cons. Is it better to have a dam there that blocked the water so that we change the habitat behind the dam than it is so that we can make electricity than it would be to build a power plant where we burn a fossil fuel to make that electricity? Or is it better for us to take out the dam because now we're more efficient in making electricity and we don't have any flooding issues and we can buy the electricity from somewhere else and not cause as much of an overall global impact? These are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself every day. Oops, not that one. So I see that Osceola is from Polk County. Now, first off, Osceola is right on the river, I believe. And if I'm correct, then part of you is just going to be right in the St. Croix River. But then I don't know where these rivers come into Polk County. So we have the Balsam Branch, the Clam River, Beaver Brook. I know you're not the Lower Apple because that's part of St. Croix. The North Fork of the Clam, the Trade River, Trout Brook. You're not the Upper Willow, because that's farther east. So one of those rivers would be your smaller watershed that you would be from. I was going to see if I could find an image of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, because Natalie mentioned it this morning, and I mentioned that as the pollutants come downstream, they end up all coming into the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to see if I can find a good image of it. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint because I'm going to have to show you it on the internet here. So let's see if I can get this. Let's see here. Ooh, that's a good picture. Share where the dead zone is.
anyone is joining us from Minnesota, feel free to let us know and we can look and see which rivers run through your area as well.
So this is essentially the watershed of the Mississippi River that's kind of outlined here. So remember, all that water is going into those rivers and they all end up in the Mississippi, which comes down here and comes out into the Gulf of Mexico. And so what this image is showing is, it's called hypoxia. Hypoxia means that there's not enough oxygen for the animals that live in the water to be able to breathe. So the darker or the less blue it is, the darker red it is, means that there's less oxygen. So out here would be fine for the animals, and here we're getting not as fine, and this green area and yellow, in this area, this is what's going to be actually the algae, the algal bloom. So algae, it's floating within the water column. It's not right on top, it's within the water column. And so this algae, as it produces oxygen, because it does produce oxygen, it grows. And the reason it's growing is because all those nutrients came in from up in the watershed above it. And when I say nutrients, I mean fertilizer, phosphorus, nitrogen. And in the ocean, in freshwater, phosphorus is what we're concerned most about as the nutrient that causes algae blooms. But in saltwater, it's nitrogen. So when the nitrogen gets down there, it's like a big buffet for algae, and they can eat and reproduce and eat and reproduce. And so we end up with this algae bloom that covers this entire space. And the algae don't live very long. And so as they go through their life cycle, they die, obviously. And when they die, they start to decompose. Well, what's decomposing them are bacteria, and the bacteria use up oxygen in the water. And that's how come the oxygen is gone. It's this process of things that happens. Extra nutrients get into the Gulf of Mexico. The algae use the nutrients to produce this huge algae bloom. And then as that algae dies, bacteria decompose the algae and they take the oxygen out from around this area. So if you're an animal that lives in this area or a plant, aquatic plant that lived there, now there's not enough oxygen for you. So in this red zone, there is nothing living there. This is Louisiana, right? They're known for their shrimping industry, and they can't shrimp anymore in some areas because of this dead zone. There's nothing living there. All right. Do you have any other questions? It's going to be a short session, I think, because I was planning on it being shorter for some reason. I don't know why. But I am happy to talk about water quality, watersheds more. If you have any questions, something I didn't answer very well.
Thank you, Aleisha. That is absolutely wonderful. And please continue to add questions in the chat or the Q&A section. We would love to get your questions answered. And I'll start out with one for you, Aleisha. Do we have any algal blooms in our watershed?
Yes, we do. And in fact, let me show you the PowerPoint again. And I'm going to show it. No, not that one. Show you. Don't really like that one. Trying to show you a picture so you can see more of the land around it. Okay, so this is Prescott, right down here at the tip of the St. Croix River watershed. And right in here, this bottom part of the St. Croix River, we actually refer to it as Lake St. Croix. And the reason that we call it Lake St. Croix is because the water spreads out and it slows down. And because of that, what happens in the water, how chemical reactions happen, the type of habitat that's there, it's more like a lake. And it's because it's widened out and it's slowed down. So in Lake St. Croix, we actually have a TMDL because of algae. And so what that means, TMDL is total maximum daily load. And it's how much nutrients can go into the lake, Lake St. Croix, and not cause an algae bloom. And so to achieve that goal, every watershed up in here has a plan to help reduce how much phosphorus is going into Lake St. Croix. Now, because I'm from here, this is St. Croix County right here. In my county, St. Croix County, I have the top 3 polluting watersheds from the St. Croix, or sorry, from the Wisconsin side. So we have number 1 is the Willow, number 2 is the Kinney, and number 3 is the Apple. The biggest one is the Willow, though. And the reason that our watersheds are the top 3 polluting is because in St. Croix County and in Pierce County, we have quite a bit of agriculture, whereas northern counties in Wisconsin are more forested. And so just because of how the land is used, up here doesn't provide as much pollution as down here. So our county does a lot to help reduce phosphorus going into Lake St. Croix so that we don't have algae blooms. On the Minnesota side, it's the same as us. It's these lower ones because, again, we have more agriculture here, and then up here is more forested. And they're doing the same thing. So working with agriculture, we work actually also with sewage treatment plants because they are releasing phosphorus as well. That would be called a point source pollutant. And so they have to have a permit to release water into the river. So remember when I said that water connects us all? We are all connected through everything that we do. Getting rid of our waste, cleaning, eating, creating food, all these things are water soaked, moving throughout the whole system. Also, so in St. Croix County, so we have a few lakes here. Squaw Lake, Bass Lake, Pine Lake, they can get algae blooms too. So yes, we can have algae blooms in our counties or in our lakes around here as well.
Very interesting. Thank you, Aleisha.
You're welcome.
Beth asked a great question. How do we protect our watershed?
Oh, wonderful question. So there are multiple things that you can do, and it depends where you are in the watershed and what land uses are around you. But a couple of the big things that you can do to protect your watershed are make sure that the water doesn't run off the property. If you can keep the water there as much as possible as was naturally happening, that's best. So for an example, in the city of River Falls or Hudson or any place that has developments, every time you add a roof or a parking lot or a road, that creates runoff because the water cannot infiltrate. It can't soak into the ground. So there are places in our watershed that used to not influence the watershed because the water would soak into the ground. But we built houses there, or we built buildings or roads, and we don't want them to flood, so we designed them to send the water away towards our rivers. Well, as that water is leaving, it's picking up any pollutant that is on, I'm looking at a parking lot out here, so on the parking lot, on the roof. It can also get warmed up, and heat can be a pollutant if we get hot water entering into the water. So we want to be able to slow it down and not have it enter into the stream or lake or river around us. So some easy things to do at your house. If you have gutters, make sure that they are pointed into your yard so that they can try and infiltrate in your yard instead of running right down the driveway and into the road. On a road, you might think that you don't live next to a river, and so you don't need to worry about it. But what you'll notice is that there are those grates that the water goes through, and those are storm drains. And so those storm drains are pipes that go straight to the river. So whatever gets onto the road goes down the storm drain and then goes to the river. In our agricultural areas, having those buffers in those areas to slow the water, making sure that that the ditches next to the roads stay as ditches and they don't become agricultural, like extra bits of agricultural, because that's where the water is going to go. And so we're going to run water through there and it's going to pick up all that soil. So those are a couple things that you could do. Do animals eat algae? No. There are some that do, but well, here's the other thing. Not all algae is the same. And so I don't want you to think, sometimes because we say that we're having an algae bloom and that's bad, that all algae is bad. And that's not true. We've changed the type of algae. So there is something called benthic algae, and it's on the bottom. And that's what we call, and the sides of things. And there are animals that eat that. There are lots of tiny little insects that eat that. And then those insects feed the fish. But what's changed is now we're getting more algae that floats in the water instead of that benthic algae. And so that algae that floats in the water, we don't have things that eat it as much. So the problem is that we don't have animals enough to eat the algae to get rid of it. So it's much better if we can stop the phosphorus in fresh water or the nitrogen into salt water from ever getting there. We want to stop it beforehand. And the best way to do that with agriculture is to keep the land covered. So having cover crops and making sure that something is over that soil throughout the entire growing season. Right now, if you would drive around in the country, you would see lots of brown because the soil has no snow cover on it anymore, but it doesn't have anything growing on it yet. So this is a time when we can get lots of soil runoff. I see, does boating and fishing impact the rivers such as the St. Croix? Anything that is done without thought, yes. So if we're not careful with our boating, we can, going fast and making lots of wake, the wake can go up onto the shore and cause shoreline erosion. So we want to make sure if we're going in through a no wake zone, the reason it's a no wake zone is you don't want those big waves coming off the back of the boat because they will start to eat away at the shoreline. Fishing impacts, a lot of fishing impacts are carrying of invasive species. So your boat, if you don't clean your boat and you go from, say, the St. Croix River to Bass Lake and to Squaw Lake in 3 days, well, you can carry with you zebra mussels, you could carry with you Eurasian milfoil, and so we should be careful about what we're transporting and making sure we're cleaning our boats and our fishing gear between places. Also, a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, a few of our invasive animals were bait that were released. So rusty crayfish was used as a bait, and now it's, instead of people getting rid of their old bait, they would dump it into the river, thinking that was better for the bait, but because it didn't really belong there, it can cause problems. And then also with fishing, that's why we have fishing licenses, is to help us regulate how much is being taken out at what time. And so there are fisheries staff, and they spend a lot of time studying how much of different types of fish are in different locations, and then trying to protect them by protecting the habitat or by working with landowners to help them protect the habitat on their property, or by limiting how many you can take, how many fish you can take. Does it harm any animals or fish? So I'm assuming it is algae, and there are some algae, they're called blue-green algae, and that kind of algae can create a toxin, and that toxin can cause issues for people and for pets, especially if like a dog is drinking the water. And so when it gets really bad, that can be an issue. In St. Croix County, we do not have many blue-green algae outbreaks. I can't think of any off the top of my head that happened recently. In Menominee, they have the Red Cedar River, and that area has had quite a few. How do bridges affect rivers? Well, that's a great question. So obviously to put a bridge in, you can try and span the entire width of the river without putting it, or You have to put things in the bed of the river so that it helps support the rest of the bridge. And so you can have construction issues as you are actually building the bridge. And I'm thinking, specifically right now, recently we had the Highway 36 bridge that just crossed from St. Croix, Stillwater into St. Croix County. And that bridge, you guys probably don't know this, but that bridge started being planned before you were born. It took 30 years to get from it first being started about at state levels to actually getting built. And so people spent their whole careers working on that project just because of impacts that the bridge could have. So the biggest thing is, I remember I said that the St. Croix, so it has extra rules about it because of that. And so when I'm going to use this one as an example, stringent, how the bridge can be shaped and what you can see. The bridge itself was being put in an area that affected some endangered mussels. So those are clam-like animals. They had to be transported and moved to a different location. You had to be careful about when they were putting the pilings around them. They had big floats that floated to capture, I would think, and that was floating on the river inside those pilings as they were doing their drilling. When I think of a smaller river and a smaller bridge, what I see happening is that the bridge can be a place that during a flood, you can get butted up against the bridge and cause it to back up. So we can have some flooding issues based off of that. So yes, bridges can affect the river, but again, if we're planning for it, we can do things for it. Alex Trebek, nice. Jeopardy. And thank you, Sophia, for adding things in there about boat speed and water quality. Do you have any other questions? But I think we have 3 more minutes to talk about water quality and rivers.
Anyone has any other questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. And if there are teachers or students listening in that would like to read up more about watersheds or water quality, Aleisha, do you have any resources that you would recommend?
I do. So a lot of the things I found were like on the USGS website, United States Geological Service. They have a whole section on watersheds. Also the Minnesota DNR and the Wisconsin DNR, you can find things about that. And in the expo area, I have a little booth, and in my booth, I have a little funny video that talks about groundwater. So remember how I said all the water cycles all connected? It makes me laugh, so I put that one in there as well. So what is the most interesting thing you have learned with being involved with this? You mean being involved with water quality or with the Youth Summit, Michaela? So water quality, all right. The most interesting thing. Well, the thing is, I think it's all interesting, so this is gonna be hard for me. I think one of the things is that people don't realize how connected they are to water. I keep going back to Natalie's presentation about when she was talking about paddling on the river, and then all of a sudden there was the power plant. You don't think about that when you flip on the light. You're affecting the water quality because we use water to cool the water power plants, not the hydropower plants, just a regular power plants. Or you think that you're not connected because you don't realize that storm drains go under the ground and take all that water with them to the river. Or that your agricultural field is gonna eventually, I don't sit next to, I shouldn't say listen, I I'm not connected to a river because my farm isn't on a river, but because of ditches and things like that, we are connected. So I think that's the most interesting thing.
Fantastic. Please join me in thanking Aleisha for her great presentation, and thank you all for attending and for your fantastic questions. We're so excited you could join us.
Yes,
We
thank you.
invite you to take some time to say hi to our exhibitors in the expo area and enjoy some lunch before our next sessions begin. Thank you all for tuning in to learn about your watershed address, and we'll see you back again at 12:30. Take care, everyone.